Is the genocide in Gaza a Christian problem? How has the Bible been used by Israel's leaders to justify the killing of Palestinians? And why are we so quick to pick sides when all of humanity bleeds red? On this episode of The News and You, part 2 of my raw, unfiltered conversation with New Zealand journalist Cole Martin, we unpack how centuries of misinterpreted scripture about Israel has fueled silence, complacency, and even complicity in the face of genocide. Cole Martin challenges Christians to keep an open mind and to rethink how prophecy and scripture are being used to justify harm, and to confront the danger of fixed mindsets and false beliefs that distort the message of love and justice at the heart of the gospel. I'm Eleisha Foon, journalist, storyteller, and I believe everyone you walk past has a story, and that story could change your life. So, let's crack it open to discover the news in you.
So Christians were both involved with the creation of Zionism, and then today it is predominantly evangelical churches, but churches across denominations who are literally fueling and funding this genocide in Gaza, like both as far as, again, Tony Dyke, Palestinian theologian, talks about the software and hardware of occupation. We are giving the software, which is the theological justifications and rationale that supports and fuels it. You know, you had church leaders coming out early on and talking about invoking the image of Amalek, which is like a Bible verse where it talks about the ancient Israelites going and killing everyone, men, women, children, animals. That came from Christian leaders first, and then Benjamin Netanyahu and Israeli leadership picked up on it and started using that rhetoric. So we provide the software of the occupation, but also the hardware. We're literally funding. There are Christian organizations that are funding these horrors. I mean, me and my mate got connected in with a group over there, predominantly funded just by Christians, and their main thing is supporting just settlements. So settlements that are illegal under international law, and it is purely Christians funding it, and their main thing is settlement security. So it is Christians funding the cameras that are used to surveil Palestinian towns, the drones that fly overhead while we're farming, fences that are used to cut Palestinians off from their own farmland. I don't think with that particular group that it extends to guns, but you cover all the rest of the stuff and it makes the guns, they can use the rest of their budget on the guns. Like, Christians are arming these private settler militia that then go and attack neighbouring Palestinian villages. Really deeply embedded, fundamentalist, very racistly driven ideology, and you see that in the settlers who come in and harass and attack villages. You see that in the settler Yenon Levy who shot my friend Alda, and Christians are directly funding and supporting it. So I think I just wish Christians would wake up and actually realise both the fruits of what they're doing, the fruits of their theology. Like, you can say your theology stands for whatever, but actually we need to judge theology by its fruits, and the fruits of Zionism is a settler colonial regime that is currently committing atrocities in Gaza that constitute genocide. You know, my friend Alda was killed because of your theology. My friends are marginalised and forced out of their homes because of your theology.
I think arriving to conclusions without truly understanding everything that has led up to October 7th to now this peace deal under Trump, and even understanding America's influence in this war is really important to touch on as well. Is that something that you could speak to?
Yeah, well, I think it ties in with a lot of the work that I've kind of been doing in the space of church engagement as well, because I think a lot of America's foreign policy, yes, is shaped by the kind of financial benefits of the arms trade, but I think it's also very much shaped by Christian and kind of nationalist, evangelical, Christian Zionist beliefs that are shaping foreign policy. And that's across the world, but it particularly exhibits itself in America, who I think provide a third of the funding for the Israeli forces.
Let's go there. Let's talk about it.
Yeah. This is kind of links into the last thing as well, as far as listening to Christian voices on the ground. Palestinian Christians, who was it? Tony Dyke, who's a Palestinian theologian, he said, if we want to get rid of groups like Hamas, try loving the Palestinians. Try giving them self-determination and dignity, and they will dismantle groups like Hamas themselves. It highlights these groups have come about because of the marginalization and persecution that Palestinians have faced. And actually, we can't bomb groups like that into submission. That just creates more people and more fear and more it creates the elements that feed people into those groups. Instead of, hey, actually, if we address the root issues here, which is decades of injustice in this colonial system that is displacing people from their land, these groups won't have the momentum behind them that they have. So feeding that then into America, what I can kind of speak to in that regard is just the Christian Zionist ideologies, and that are kind of driving a lot of the Christian support for Israel.
I guess one of the main beliefs, let's touch on the first one, is that Israel is a chosen nation, and therefore if you come against Israel, if you curse Israel, you will be cursed. And anything that essentially Israel can defend itself however it wants to defend itself because it's God's chosen. What is your response to that? And let's unpack that ideology.
Yeah. Reverend Muntha Isaac, who's been one of the leading Palestinian Christian voices at a conference recently, said that the problem with Christian Zionism is that Christ isn't in it. And I agree. I think when you actually unpack these things, to say all of that, to say Israel are God's chosen people, the land is theirs, they can do what they want, to hand out a free pass card skips everything in the Gospels. Where is love your neighbor? Where is show mercy? Where is seek justice? Where is walk humbly? Where is love the widow, the orphan, those on the margins? All of that kind of gets pushed to the side for this particular reading of the Old Testament, and particularly some verses in Genesis that are just taken very out of context. I think it's Genesis 12, verse 3. People quote it as, bless Israel and you'll be blessed, curse Israel and you'll be cursed. That's not what it says. It's not talking to a modern political state. It's talking to one person. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And it's in a particular context where it's talking about, God's not a real estate manager. He's not, giving out the land freely, and once it's given, there's no strings attached. Firstly, it's dissecting actually this modern political state called Israel, just because it has the same name. Can we really see it as a continuation of the ancient Israelites? Is it based on ethnicity and race, or is it based on religious reasons? I don't think there's a very strong basis for the modern state of Israel, because actually many of the Palestinian Christians and Muslims who are in the land today are direct descendants of the people who have lived in that land for thousands of years. So I don't think you can make a strong, and that's not to say that those who are part of Israel don't share that, but to say that they hold that at a more kind of exclusive rate than those who have literally lived in the land for millennia, I don't think has a very strong basis to it. If you're going off a genetics thing, I think it's incredibly dangerous as well. You err into all kinds of blood quantums and all of that really harmful, quite dangerous, racist area. And if you're going from a theological perspective, like someone who holds the Jewish faith and beliefs, I don't think you can point to the modern state of Israel and say that they're adhering to much, if any, of those callings of the ancient Jewish people or the ancient Israelites. And that's where I think we need to understand the role of the ancient Israelites in the Old Testament. We look at what were they called for? We look at, the chosen people. What does that mean? Chosen for what? They were called to live in a particular way. They were chosen to live in a particular way, not chosen like they were superior to anyone else. We're suggesting otherwise that God's a racist God. That's this idea that God has this group of people that he's set above everyone else. But that doesn't even add up in Scripture. I mean, you look at the lineage of Jesus, for instance, and you have all of these different Gentiles who have been part of that and become part of that, not because they, bowed down and worshipped this race of people. It's because they lived in a way that was honoring of God and of creation and of those around them.
Gentiles are non-Jewish people.
Yes, sorry, that's a good context to add there. So going right back to the start, I split it into humanness and Christ-likeness are two very similar models. Humanness is how we're wired, how we're created as people. We are created, right back at the beginning of Genesis, to live in right relationship with God, with each other, and with creation. And by living in right relationship with creation and with each other, we're honoring God in doing that. And we'd be dishonoring God if we're not doing that. It's like if I told Leonardo da Vinci that I love his work while defacing the Mona Lisa. Clearly, I don't love him if I'm doing that, if I'm destroying his creation. And so it's the same kind of theory. How we treat others and how we treat creation is how we treat God. What Jesus says, what you have done for the least of these, you have done to me. And so then this humanness, how we're supposed to live as humans, kind of shifts when you come this, we're living in a broken world full of broken relationships and systems that actively are harming and persecuting and marginalizing people. We can't live as fully human because we are actively a part of these broken systems. We're complicit whether we want to be or not. But that's where Christ-likeness comes into it. And that's how do we live like Christ did. He lived at a time where there were broken systems all around him. He was living under empire. He was living within like a religious structure like we have today, where people are marginalized, where we choose doctrine over humanity, and there's no exceptions as to, how to love people. Instead, it's just rules-based, and if you're doing it wrong, you're kind of shunned to the side and you're sinful, and it's really harmful stuff. But Jesus came and he lived an example of what it can look like to live well and to address those systems. If we're ultimately wired to live human-like in right relationship with God, creation, and each other, how do we address these systems so we can get to a point where we can do that? Systems that are harming people, marginalizing people. How do we confront those systems and unpack them? And there's so many, and it looks like so many different examples of injustice across the world. Justice, this idea of justice and righteousness in the Bible is central to the gospel, and yet we've kind of abandoned that instead for this very kind of spiritual call of like, we've over-spiritualized everything. I think Christianity becomes so much about just creating more Christians, but quite frankly, like, I don't want more Christians if they're like some of the ones that I know. Like, I don't. I'd actually much rather spend time with people who don't claim to know Christ, but actually live a lot more like Christ than a lot of people I know who claim to know Christ. God sees that as a lot more important. God's not going to read the contract and say, did you, what memorandum of understanding did you read when you signed up to church? He's going to say, did you love the lost? Did you love the least, the orphans and the widows? Did you seek justice? That's what we're called to do as Christians. I think that's why this is such a compelling thing, what's happening in Gaza. I think Winther Isaac has described Gaza as the moral compass of the world, and that's because it is. I think if you start to unravel the threads of whatever theology justifies what's happening in Gaza, the whole thing's going to fall apart, and that's scary for people. Because I think you can't hold to a theology that justifies what's happening in Gaza and yet think that it somehow aligns with Christ. It doesn't. What we're seeing in Gaza is the opposite of everything Christ called us to do and to live out.
Why do you think churches are still holding on to this theology which is supporting Israel and supporting the genocide in Gaza?
A lot of the time, churches just don't actually realize what it equates to on the ground or realize that there's a different way. I think a lot of people have grown up in a church space where it's just presumed, well, I'm Christian, so I have to support Israel. But it never says that in the Bible. You can find parts of the Bible and use them to say that it says that. But we're called to love God. We're called to seek justice and to stand with people against all forms of injustice, no matter who they are. When the church actually creates space for people to unpack this idea that this modern political entity called Israel is the same as the ancient Israelites, and I think most people realize they're not the same when they actually see the reality of what's happening on the ground. And that's why I've been so convicted, as well as a journalist who has been there and seen what's happening on the ground. Maybe it's naive, but I hold the hope actually that most people, when they see the reality, they do have enough humanity to recognize that it is wrong and to know that they need to do something about it. But there are those who don't as well. I've got a couple of uncles who are very Christian Zionists, and I've had conversations with them, and you can tell that it's stuff they've never really discussed or been confronted with before. And I think, again, that's something that the church needs to repent of, is the way that we've kind of warped pilgrimage or Holy Land tourism in a really harmful way. People call it like the Disneyfication of the Holy Land. Like we go on these great pilgrimages and we visit all the holy sites and we touch the stones and we're like, oh, that's an old, like Jesus walked here. And we get these kind of real personal kicks out of it. Like, wow, I've been where Jesus was. But we don't actually engage with the political reality. Most tourists that go to the Holy Land don't actually even visit the West Bank. At best, maybe they go to the Nativity Church in Bethlehem. But even then, I've heard stories of tour groups who have stood on a hill in Jerusalem and kind of looked over the apartheid wall and said, there it is. There's the church built over top of where Christ was born, but we can't go there. It's too dangerous. It's fueled by these very racist narratives of like, oh, the dangerous Arab, or very kind of anti-Islam stuff. And I think that's probably a lot of the driving force as well for churches. I think there's a real kind of fear and demonization of Islam that, again, is built on double standards. Like, yeah, there are groups in the world who have weaponized Islam for their own ends. There are groups in the world that have weaponized, as we're seeing in Gaza, Judaism to their own ends. There are groups in the world, as we're seeing, actually argue as a Christian more so than any other group. I think Christianity, when paired with empire, has been one of the most harmful forces in the world. But I hold to the fact that it is good because I've read the Gospels and I find Jesus the most convicting, compelling example of what justice and reconciliation can look like. You can't defeat your enemies with hate and violence. Like, maybe you can in the short term, but you're just going to make more enemies. You can defeat your enemies by making them friends. And that's far more difficult, and it's far more confronting, and it's far more messy, but it's critical. And that's something that has really been reinforced to me by walking with Palestinian Christians who, for years and years, alongside Palestinian Muslims and Palestinians of no faith, have led these creative non-violent resistance efforts. The Nassad family, who live just outside of Bethlehem on the hilltop farm that they have owned for over 100 years, one of the last hilltops in that area that hasn't had a settlement built on it. Every other hilltop around them is surrounded by these Israeli settlements. And yet they, despite facing settlers coming onto their farm and stealing things, vandalising them, threatening them, 35 years it must be now, legal battle in the Israeli courts to hang on to the land, to prove that it's theirs. They have all the ownership papers, but it keeps getting pushed off till a later date. And yet despite all of that, they have said from the very start, we refuse to be enemies. That's their motto. We refuse to let you make us hate. We won't hate. We want to love our neighbours, and we actually believe that that's what's going to change this. And it's not this kind of passive acceptance. It's not saying, oh no, I'm not going to respond. It's active resistance, but it's active resistance that still seeks to pull out the humanity in the oppressor, to liberate the oppressor from their oppression as well, because that's, it's not just harmful to those who are being oppressed, but it's harmful to you as a human being. For the crimes that we're seeing in Gaza just completely defile the humanity, both of the people that they're being committed to, but or maybe even more so, of the people who are committing them. I think when our churches, as I say, create the space for people to engage, for people to learn more, I think we will see a change. And I do think either way it's critical. Whether it affects foreign policy or not, we need to, as a church, recognise the harm that we have created. We need to repent for what we've done. We actually need to seek reconciliation, whether that looks like reparations, whatever it looks like. It's not jumping straight to what's the solution. It's actually sitting and listening to Palestinians and what they've experienced and understanding what they are experiencing. And not handing out mercy on behalf of others. I think that's something the church does really well. Even when they do realise, they say, oh, it's so difficult. What a pity there's nothing we can do about it. When actually there's so much we can do about it. And that's one of the reasons we need to do something. But also we kind of say, oh, well, God calls us to forgive. So let's just forgive. You can't forgive on behalf of someone else. We're not the ones facing the violence. Who am I to forgive an Israeli soldier who beats my Palestinian friend? Especially if he's still beating my Palestinian friend. Who am I to stand next to him and be like, I forgive you, as he keeps committing that violence? Until those systems end, we need to seek an end to those systems. That's where the church needs to step up. Listen to the oppressed, listen to Palestinians, and Palestinian Christians in particular, who have been speaking up for a long, long time. So often we have silenced them. As a church, we have marginalised them. I think just make the space, make the time, make this a priority. This is inherently a Christian issue, and we can't keep avoiding it. I think there's churches who are actively involved, but more so I think there's actively involved in a really harmful way. But I think actually the majority of churches are involved through a far more passive way, which is just not engaging in the first place. And that's almost more harmful, because we think that we're doing something good. We think that we're kind of sitting on the fence being nice and balanced, but we're not. That's an active choice, and it is erasing our Palestinian Christian community. It's erasing those who have kept the flame of our faith alive in the land for millennia. They're being forced out. There's dozens of families who have left Bethlehem since October 7th because the conditions have got even worse. Before the creation of Israel, Palestinian Christians were 10% of the population, I think it was. Now they're just 1 to 2%. They're facing all the same violence as everyone else. And I think that's another thing to really challenge is we have this notion that Palestinian Christians are being forced out by Islam or by Muslims. And that's just not the reality. If you speak to Palestinian Christians and they all say no. They're our neighbours, they're our friends, our business partners. We've grown up with them. My friend Yusuf Al-Khoury, who is the academic dean of Bethlehem Bible College, he grew up in Gaza. And he describes his neighbours weren't just neighbours, they were family. Literally within Palestinian culture, he described, I didn't know this, that if you wet nurse someone's child more than 3 times, I think it is, you culturally become part of the family. And he's lost close friends and family members when the Church of St. Porphyrius was bombed in Gaza. People just don't realise that Palestinian Christians exist, that there are churches in Gaza. And it shouldn't take that for us to care. But if that's what it takes for people to wake up and care, then please wake up and care as far as this is a Christian issue. What I mean by that is the idea of Zionism, the political movement which founded the settler colonial project of Israel in 1948. The idea of Zionism actually began in the early 1800s with Christians in Europe. It was a Christian ideology before it was anything Jewish, and a lot of early Jewish leaders really pushed back against it when it started becoming a Jewish thing. But it stemmed from Christian ideology that kind of had this idea that, if we return all the Jewish people to the land, then Jesus will come again. That will like spur the second coming. And it also incredibly like anti-Semitic and racist ideas that it was about forcing the Jews out of Europe. I mean, it's European anti-Semitism that led to the Holocaust. It wasn't Palestinians. And yet within a generation, if you ask now who is the enemy of, like, who's the biggest threat to the Jewish people, people would say Arabs, Islam. They didn't commit the Holocaust. That was European Christians. That was us. And that's also something we need to repent for. And I think the guilt of that has also created an environment where a lot of church leaders are scared to engage out of fear that they will be labelled anti-Semitic. And that fear is understandable. But when you look at the reality on the ground, none of this is driven by anti-Semitism. We're standing up against Israel because of what they are doing to Palestinians. And actually, I think like the people who are turning up weekly, who are pushing for change, they're the people who would have stood up against the Holocaust. They're the people who would have hidden the likes of Anne Frank. And yet instead they're kind of getting swept with this brush of anti-Semitism. I think it's incredibly unfair and just incredibly dangerous, because it also conflates the horror of what Israel is doing with Judaism, which is, it's not representative of Judaism. Yeah.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. I just wanted to pop in and say if the news and you is something you love listening to, you can help me to keep it going by joining my Patreon community. Your support helps me tell more stories that matter, the kind that brings about compassion and a deeper understanding for others, culture, and the world around us. If you believe in the work we do, head to patreon.com/Eleisha Foon. That's ELEISHAFOON. The link's in the bio, and be sure to follow the News and You on Instagram for more behind-the-scenes moments, announcements, and updates. Thank you so much for your support. Let's get back into the conversation.
It's so real because you've been there, you've experienced it and witnessed it, and these things are being done all in the name of prophecy. How important is it for Christians to become critical thinkers and to fully realize that love in the gospel perhaps looks a little different than murder, genocide, and doing whatever you want, all in the name of Israel, God's chosen people, and fulfilling prophecy?
It's so important. I've never walked in those spaces. Like, I grew up Anglican. I'm still in the Anglican Church. We have our own problems of passive complicity. People need to move beyond this kind of over-spiritualization of everything. Jesus, when he talks about serving the widow and the orphan and all of these people on the margins that Jesus talks about, he's not talking about the spiritual orphan or the spiritual widow, the spiritually poor. He's talking about the literal orphans, the literal widows, those who literally don't have enough food or belongings to get by. So we do need to be very critical in our thinking. And I think that's across the church. There's not, like, I'm not here to bash evangelicals. That's across every denomination. I mean, even for me, like, my parents' generation grew up with the narrative of Israel, the plucky wee state defending themselves against their dangerous Arab neighbors, like really problematic and dehumanizing language. We grew up in Sunday school reading about Israel in the Bible, and then we see a modern state with the same name, and it's kind of natural that people would just go and presume like, oh, yeah, well, it's the same. It's in the same place, and they're saying that as Christians we're supposed to support them, so I guess I'll support them. But yeah, people need to think critically, listening to the oppressed, listening to those who are on the ground facing things. I think we need to, and this is for media as well, like we need to move beyond just listening to political leaders, military leaders. Listen to the everyday people. Listen to those who are losing their homes. Listen to those who are being beaten and oppressed. Listen to those who are on the margins. Stop amplifying the voices of those who already have a platform and, quite frankly, have good reason to be using that platform for whatever intentions they have. Rather, listen to the people who are putting themselves on the line, risking everything. I haven't met someone who has been to the West Bank and not been deeply moved by it. And I mean properly been to the West Bank. I don't mean tour groups who've kind of gone on a bus to the Nativity Church, had some falafel at the nearby store, and then gone back to Jerusalem. I mean, go stay with these families, people with names, with stories, with experiences, things that they're facing every day. I've never met people as welcoming as Palestinians. And this comes despite the hardship. People are going without so much. Yeah, and you don't have to go as well. There's Palestinians all around the world. I think this is the thing when people kind of say, oh, it's difficult to know what's happening on the ground in Gaza or in the West Bank. I don't know which media to trust. Find a Palestinian, someone who has family in Gaza. That's why I trust when I hear these reports of stuff that's going on, like I might not be in the town of Al Nughayr that had, thousands of olive trees cut down a few weeks ago as kind of collective punishment. But I trust them when they say that all of these trees were demolished. One, because I've seen the footage, and two, because I know that it's exactly the kind of thing the Israeli regime do, because I have met with those who have faced that violence. And so the same thing, how do you know people are starving in Gaza? Well, because I have friends who have family there. I have friends who have grown up there.
Do you feel like Western media have let the public down by not doing more with their coverage?
Yeah. Big time. I think they've let it down. And I think a lot of them don't even realise it. And there's some big media groups around the world that are very much controlled by funding and by power dynamics of kind of who holds the strings at the top, and different, whether that's from editors or stakeholders and so forth. Like a lot of New Zealand's media, I think it is genuine ignorance as well. I mean, we've got journalists who are flat out trying to cover multiple stories within a day. They grab an article, they don't understand the historical context of it, and they just republish it. Coming from, for a place like New Zealand, for example, where we depend on a lot of syndicated sources, so the likes of BBC, CNN, Associated Press, Reuters, those groups have displayed like a really harmful bias. I mean, BBC, there was a report released recently looking at the BBC coverage since the beginning of the genocide and just how dehumanizing it was, both in terms of who it platforms, who it kind of gives names to. We've got, it seems like quite basic stuff, but it shapes the narrative. You do a profile piece on one of the Israeli captives, but you don't do profile pieces on the thousands of Palestinian captives who've been in prison without charge or trial for many, many years. Even the language, we talk about Israeli hostages, but Palestinian prisoners, which insinuates, one's been put in prison for good reason or fair trial, which is a journalist who has sat in the military courts there and seen these trials. I can tell you it's not fair trial. It's incredibly corrupt. And again, that's not to take away from the fact that the Israelis are hostages. They've been taken as hostages. But, people will justify it and say, oh, well, that Palestinian was part of an armed resistance movement. Well, that Israeli was part of the army. What's the difference between them? Both have killed people, and you're justifying why one deserves it and the other doesn't based on the same rationale. Again, it's double standards. The language, the use of language that media, I think it's improved a little bit, but it still hasn't. Media will talk about this many Israelis were violently slaughtered on October 7th. This many Palestinians died. They died. It's kind of the passive versus active voice. One was intentionally killed, one was died. One just kind of, happened to die. Or Palestinians in Gaza just happened to be starving. Not that they are being starved by intentional policy decisions of the Israeli state. The real dissonance between the way that we talk about these two groups. And I think for some people, it's not actually something they've thought about. Like I met with a good friend who I studied with, who was like top of the class in journalism, and she, it wasn't something that was built into the course where they discussed the power of language, and they hadn't thought about the power, the difference between killed versus died. And again, that's not because I didn't raise it with them because they were doing it themselves, but it was just part of a discussion, and I was like, oh man, this is this is a journalism course, and we're not looking at the basics like that. Bias can be more harmful and less harmful, but we all have world experiences, and that shaped how we see things. If we're not aware of those things, they will shape how we write and how we report. And I'm involved in advocacy for Palestinians as well. Does that impact how I write? Maybe, but am I going to let it impact how I write in a way that is dishonest? No. So I'm aware of my bias. I don't know, I feel like there's this kind of idea, oh, well, Cole's been there, he actually knows Palestinians, therefore maybe he's biased. No, it means I've seen the reality, and I'm going to write honestly about what I say. I'm not going to water down what I say for certain. I think there's lots of little elements as to how dehumanized and dehumanizing our media have been of Palestinians, and the double standards of how we write about Israelis, Palestinians, that has not just kind of been something that misinforms people and misframes the situation, but actually, when you look at it in the scheme of things, media doesn't just reflect society, we shape society. Talking the chain of effect, something happens in Gaza, we write about it in a really passive way, people read it and they're like, okay, well that sucks, and so they don't put pressure on the government, and so foreign policy isn't shaped, and so there's no accountability, and so Israel continue doing what they're doing. So it's this very direct link towards the way that actually it's not just that we're misleading people, it actually does facilitate the conditions of genocide, even from afar. And it's the same with churches. The way we read scripture, the things we justify and rationalize on a Sunday service, it creates the conditions to dehumanize Palestinians. It creates the conditions that allow us to look the other way or to actively support and fund this stuff. I think media have very much let down. I actually think there's so much overlap as far as the media and the church, I think, in terms of how we're narratives to dehumanize and to impact in really, really harmful ways. And both those spaces, the church and media circles, really need to repent of that, which means like not just saying, oh, sorry, but actually actively working towards making those things better.
I think it's important to remember as well that Israel's one of the most powerful nations in the world. In terms of finances as well, there's been publicly a lot of propaganda. We're seeing Benjamin Netanyahu speak to influencers. We might see a takeover of TikTok as well. What are your thoughts on the way Benjamin Netanyahu is really pursuing this channel of propaganda and shaping and using prophecy and using Christian theology to do that?
Yeah, I mean, it is terrifying. I think, for one, I think he's incredibly scared of social media because it's done what media around the world hasn't done. International journalists have not been allowed into Gaza, and because of the dehumanization that has kind of been spurred for so long, people a lot of people don't trust Palestinian journalists who have been doing incredible journalism. Like, they literally have been risking their lives, right? I think it's over 250 journalists who have been killed in Gaza in the last 2 years. Like, that's more than, I think, every other conflict in the last however many years combined. I can't recall the exact stats, but it's staggering. Like, there's nothing close that even comes close to it. It's more than all of the journalists killed in World War II. I think trying to control the narrative because they're aware that in these social media spaces, we have been seeing a live stream genocide. We've been seeing these things happening in real time, stuff that isn't being faked, stuff that isn't AI. I think people love to point to it and say, oh, half of it's faked and that's not real. Or like the example of the kid, the horrific photo of a young boy from Gaza who was absolutely starved through to, you could see his rib cage, and like it shocked the world. And then people kind of came out and said, oh no, well, he has pre-existing health conditions as well. That doesn't make it any better. So they're starving kids with health conditions as well. So that, I think that's been the power of social media, is that it breaks through where a lot of the kind of corporate complicity in media organizations, or just the lack of good journalism, it breaks through that because it just goes directly to the people. And so I think Netanyahu, which also worth noting, well, he's on the topic that he's a war criminal, and he's had an arrest warrant out for him, and lots of countries have, said they're going to uphold that. He is, I just have no words to describe how evil he is, just to acknowledge that. But yeah, I mean, in many ways, they're very clever in the way that they use propaganda. Israel and Netanyahu as a whole, they are very good at shaping the narrative. They're very good at delaying things until they're not newsworthy anymore. Like when they do something horrific and people buy it. And I think, again, that's where media needed to be more, have needed and still need to be more questioning. We've seen things like live on air, they bombed a hospital and killed journalists and first responders who came to the scene. Like, they did they call it a double tap, like 2 airstrikes, one after the other. And they said, it was an accident. And then after a few days, they said, no, it wasn't an accident, but we were targeting a Hamas camera, whatever that is. You've got things like the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, which I think you said happened while you were working for Al Jazeera, which was devastating for people across the region. Like, Shireen, Palestinian Christian journalist, incredibly well-trusted, well-reputable, and she was assassinated, shot on the head by an Israeli sniper. And to begin with, they said, no, it wasn't us. We're the most moral army in the world. She must have been caught in the crossfire, and it would have been a Palestinian militant who shot her. And then people did investigations, and they're like, there weren't any armed Palestinians in the area. That's just a brazen lie. And so they said, maybe there's a possibility that happened. But by the time the truth comes out, weeks have passed, it's not breaking news again, and so the majority of media don't cover it, and so there isn't accountability. And you've seen that with airstrikes on hospitals in Gaza. You've seen that with the ambulances buried, and Israel said, it was an accident and we buried the ambulances in order to preserve the bodies. It wouldn't be complicated if it was happening to us, if there was a hospital in New Zealand that got bombed, or a school in the US that got bombed. It's only complicated because we can afford to say, it's complicated. But actually, it's incredibly simple. When you have legal definitions like genocide and apartheid, and you have the world experts whose job it is to identify those things, genocide is bad, apartheid is bad. Sure, there's complexities within what it looks like to move forward, to seek reconciliation, but the context itself is not complicated. And when we say that it is, it's just a way to kind of brush off the responsibility to someone else, and that has been potentially even more harmful than the really active justifications for it. It's just the kind of the passive apathy and complicity of media, churches, organisations across the world who have kind of said, it's not our problem until it's us. That is, if we were the ones facing it, it would be a big problem. It wouldn't be complicated. We would want the world to act.
Thank you for making it your problem and for shining a light. What can we expect with your documentary?
So I interviewed a bunch of, between last year and this year, my time on the ground, interviewed a bunch of Palestinian Christian leaders, theologians, different academics and activists across the West Bank, farmers, all sorts of people to kind of create basically a multi-part resource that delves into what is happening on the ground so that people can actually see footage of these house demolitions, footage of assaults, to understand both the context of what's happening, unpack some of the really unhealthy theology that churches hold around it, and then look at what then does a Christ-centered response look like for churches. But hopefully it will be helpful wider afield than churches. I mean, as I say, I know a lot of people who wouldn't call themselves Christians who would be far more interested in a resource like that.
Thank you for listening to The News and You. Your support means the world. If you believe in the work we do at The News and You, sign up to our Patreon. It really is the best way to keep this going and be part of the Newsies community. I'd be so grateful if you can share the love by leaving a rating and review. It'll help spread these stories even further. What are your key takeaways? If this story impacted you, or even made you see the world a little differently, why not share it with your friends and family? Until next time, remember, your story matters, and there's a shared truth behind everything.